All right. Hello. Welcome to today's introduction to the Hebrew Bible, the end of Genesis, if we can get through it. Joseph's narrative is a big one, so we might wind up dividing this into 2 weeks, depending on the pace at which we move. But it's good to be with you all today for this. I'm going to go ahead and turn my screen share on so that you can see the presentation today. Here we go. That one. All right. There we go. You all see that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Wonderful. So open this up a little bit. Great. All right. Let's dig in. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. Your way, O God, is holy. Who is so great a God as our God? You are the God who works wonders and have declared your power among the peoples. By your strength you have redeemed your people, the children of Jacob and Joseph. Amen.
Amen.
That's a portion of Psalm 693. That's not accurate. There's no Psalm. It's on page 693 of the prayer book. Let me give you the actual Psalm citation here. I was looking, I'm like,
your Bible have?
It's that Anglican Bible. We just like to keep adding this stuff. Let me see. There it is. Psalm 77. It's a portion of Psalm 77, which I thought was fitting since we're kind of dealing with the end of the story of Jacob's children, at least immediate children, today. So I thought it'd be a good way to get us going and into the text. Reminder for those, for you all, of course, these are the texts we're using in this course that I'm using. I also should say, I'm kind of lying to you because I'm using a different text pretty significantly right now. And where did I set it down? I want to show it to you in case you're looking for, if you're really enjoying this Genesis stuff. Where did I set that? Where did I set that? I've got a really great system so I don't lose things. I kind of just put them in hope. So it's, I don't see it with me. Let me show you another one though. I bet you I left it at home because I was working on this at home this weekend. So this is Berit Olam is the series, Studies in Hebrew Narrative and Poetry, edited by David Cohen. And Berit Olam is a really, really nice series. Its companion set is Sacra Pagina, which is the New Testament version, but Berit Olam is the Old Testament version. It's published by, I want to say, Catholic Press. Yeah, Liturgical Press publishes it. So that's a Benedictine press from Order of St. Benedict. And the Genesis commentary is really good. Some of the things we've talked about as we've moved through Genesis that we've said, there are varying interpretations on. I don't always interpret it the same way the commentator does, but it's a very good commentary. So if you've loved this Genesis stuff and would like to just dig deeply into it, I really commend that to you. It's a really fantastic book. And a lot of what we've been doing has been coming from insights I've gotten from that. Because the other book that I recommend, How to Read the Bible book by book, is very, very basic. So I can't fill up an hour of lecture time with the information in that text. But that text is good for a 1-volume commentary. So as we're coming to the end of Abraham's family tree, we want to refresh our memory. Hopefully we reviewed this enough time that you all know this squirrely family tree of intermarriage that's going on here. Everyone's marrying their cousins and their aunts and uncles. And of course, all of the sons of Terah, Abraham, of course, winds up the father of the children of Israel, the Israelites, the promised line. And everyone else winds up creating nations that are enemies of the Israelites. The Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Ishmaelites. So that's one way of hating your family, I guess, is to blame all the nations that attack you on them. Never gets old. And of course, remembering who the 4 patriarchs are, where we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then of the 12 tribes, Joseph, who, interesting enough, as we've talked about before, is one of the 4 patriarchs in the Genesis narrative, but he is not the father of the promise as it descends through into Judah in David and then the Messiah. That comes through Judah's line. Joseph, of course, being the eldest daughter of Rachel, so the favored son of his father Jacob, but Judah being the son of the unloved Leah, if you remember that from the Rachel and Leah narrative. Also want to remind you of Jacob's story, how Jacob's story is one of those great things, those great chiasms, and if I make it a little bigger for you, we'll ask ourselves always, what's at the center of the chiasm? And when I make it bigger, the center of the chiasm of Jacob's story is that blessing of children. That's where his narrative really turns. And that plays out in the Joseph text, which is much longer than Jacob's story, because the biggest thing that matters about Jacob is that he has the 12 promised children, who eventually, in of a form of sorts, become the 12 tribes of Israel. So that's some just review of where we've kind of been. Any questions on that? It is amazing, this chiastic structure, because it's the sort of thing you don't realize when you're reading the Bible, but then you start looking and it's all over the place. It's a very common literary device and structure. We'll do a shortened version of a chiastic structure today with one of our texts as well that I'll talk about a little bit later.
Jared,
Yeah.
if you have time, maybe at the end, can you talk a little bit about the whole Jacob wrestling with God thing? Because we didn't really get into that at all, and that was today's reading, and it's a very confusing story.
Yeah, it is a weird story, and it's fascinating. We talked about how last week how, you know, and if you look in the chiasm, Jacob's wrestling with God is E, so it serves as a counterpoint of E prime. It serves as a counterpoint to E, which is the vision of the Lord at Bethel, and they're very different. When Jacob sees God at Bethel, the angels are going up and down. They don't pay attention to him. You know, God speaks to him, but God speaks to him from the gate of heavens, not down there with him. And then when he encounters God later in his life, the angels greet him at the river and they journey with him. And God doesn't just speak to him, but God wrestles with him. And there are two ways of taking that. One is that this is showing that Jacob's character is really developed, in the sense that he's much more attuned to God and to the divine at this point in his life. And that being and having grown spiritually doesn't mean he doesn't wrestle with God. Mature people still wrestle with God, but it means now he's actually wrestling with God instead of scheming his way out of having to deal with God.
One observation.
Yeah.
In the nighttime vision, God is at the top of the ladder, but the Lord is standing next to Jacob.
Yeah, and there's a tricky thing there in terms of how you translate the Hebrew preposition there, and different translations handle that differently. But one of the very natural translations is that the Lord is right to the side of Jacob, is right beside Jacob, speaking to him.
And Yahweh is always closer than Elohim.
Yeah, always, right, always.
So the wrestling match wouldn't have been just physical; it also would have been spiritual and intellectual.
We don't know. I mean, the text just says he wrestles with God, but we've kind of interpreted it as that as being kind of beautiful symbolism for what it means to follow God. That's what we all do, right? We're all wrestling with God at various points in our life. Now the other approach to this text is that Jacob has no redemptive narrative. And that you see that he gets to the other side and he's still fighting with God. He still is submitting. Like that's the way that actually the author of the commentary that I'm using from Berit Olam takes this text. I disagree with him because, as I said last week, I see a beautiful redemption in that narrative. And then he receives the blessing in the new name, and leaves with a limp. And as he leaves with a limp, he walks past Peniel or Penuel. It's given two different names, but basically means face of God. And then we talked about last week how it immediately, this is all happening, the wrestling with God, in the context of his getting ready to see Esau again for the first time after 20 years. And so part of that wrestling is his wrestling with his own betrayal of his older brother. And then when he sees Esau and Esau doesn't want to kill him, Esau falls on his shoulders crying. So glad to have his brother back. That Jacob says to Esau that seeing your face is like seeing the face of God, who he just saw. So there's something there as well in that narrative, I think, about the restoration there. So that's kind of a thumbnail. If we have more time, we can chat a little bit more about that at the end of today's session. So real quick, let me open my Zoom back. Any other questions before we kind of jump in?
I
All
sent
right.
you a chat question.
Huh?
I sent you a chat question.
Oh, a chat question. Let's open up the chat. All right. I'm really good at this. There it is. Where's the chat? Well, it sounded like it was physical. Yeah, his hip was dislocated. He touched him right in the hip. So yeah, definitely it was a physical wrestling that had maybe deeper implications. Yeah, absolutely. And that he left limping. And that's also commentators have also found to be a kind of a beautiful articulation for what following God is like. That we wrestle with God. God blesses us. Sometimes we wind up limping after that wrestling, but the blessing does come. That's good. Thanks, Dad. Good. So moving now, before we get into the Joseph story, when we get into some of these narratives that are larger narratives and more poignant, it's very easy to start assuming all kinds of things into the text that may not be a part of the story. And so a really good interpretive question to ask yourself when you're interpreting scriptures: who is the one who is interpreting the text? Am I the reader interpreting the biblical text? Is that what's going on? Or is the biblical text interpreting me? Because if you will let the biblical text interpret you, you will often find some very important things said about, why do I resist this story? Why do I find this narrative unsettling? Just, I've muted you all, so feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to chat. But if you will let the biblical text interpret you, then you will find a rich, deeper understanding of who you are in the sight of God. Now, of course, that's kind of an expression, because it's not like the biblical text is an active entity that you can be like, hey, Bible, what's going on with me right now? So you're always doing some interpreting, but the goal is to not be putting yourself into the text, which is eisegesis from the Greek for into, but exegesis is to pull from the text. But to pull from the text and then let the text interpret you and how you function with your neighbor, how you function with God. And so we may return to that a few times during this series, but that's just always a good question: is am I the one making the Bible say this because I want the Bible to say this, or am I seeing the way the Bible is maybe asking me to see myself a little differently than I want to? That's the good question to try to get to. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's who is doing the interpreting is the question we always want to ask ourselves there. So let's go ahead and do the Joseph narrative. Let me grab my Bible. I left my Bible at home too. I am on top of it today. Get the backup Bible. So we're going to be in Genesis. We're going to start in 37. I'm not going to cover all of his story, because his story is basically from 37 to the end of the book of Genesis, chapter 50. And I could just read that to you all if I wanted to. But I would say my hope is after this class, if you didn't read it in advance, that maybe this week you'll sit down and just read the story of Joseph. You can read it in one sitting. It doesn't take long, but it is such a great story. So we had, if you remember last week, we left off at chapter 35, where Jacob finally returns home and sees his father on his father's deathbed. Remember that when Jacob left his family, he never again saw his mother, who he was her favorite. He never saw her again. And then he only ever saw his father again right before his father died. He had truly and fully separated himself from his family. So there's the narrative of the death of Isaac at the end of 35. And then there's the genealogy of Esau's descendants, remembering, of course, that a genealogy is a narrative bridge. So that genealogy functions two ways. First, it is to transition you from the story of Jacob to the story of Joseph, but also it's to conclude the story of Esau, because they do that also with like Ishmael. We'll give you the genealogy of Ishmael and his children, but then we're done telling the story of Ishmael. Same thing. We'll tell you the story of Esau and his children, but then and they become the Edomites, but then we're kind of done with the Edomites for the most part. So all of that gets you to verse 37. You see there's a parallel here, because the beginning of chapter 36, these are the descendants of Esau, that is Edom. And you notice as well, Esau's wives are all Canaanite women, right? So there's a shift happening in the narrative. That was verboten before, but now that was happening. For Joseph, Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived, which is funny, right? Because Jacob just died. right? 2 chapters ago. So they're kind of like, they told you about how Jacob, not Jacob died, Isaac died. So Jacob settles in the land where his father Isaac had lived, who had just died, is an ally in the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. And you'd be expecting a genealogy, but you don't get one. Instead, you get an actual story. So here we go. I'll go to verse 11. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I dreamed." So there we were binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Man, this kid's a real tool. His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. And he had another dream. He can't shut up. He got verbal diarrhea. And he told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I have another dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars were all bowing down to me." What do you think that means, guys? But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of a dream is that you've had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and brothers, and bow down to the ground to you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Oh my gosh, what an idiot. Kept the matter. This is the argument that Jacob never really actually has a redemptive arc, that he's always kind of an idiot throughout. So right off the bat, you're going to notice some thematic keys in this narrative. Stuff that we've heard before. We've got a favored child, right? Have we heard stories about favored children before? It's that whole narrative all over again, the favored child. We got the elder child being supplanted by the younger, because Joseph, of course, is one of the youngest of the sons, and saying that he's the one that's gonna, reign over them. And that's, that's funny that Jacob, who had done that, right, and had supposedly seen the error of his ways, and then his son starts pulling that, and Jacob's like, "Don't tell people about those dreams." But then he just thinks about it a lot. He's like, "Well, I don't know, maybe he will. Let's see." Tension among brothers, right? Once again, just Esau and Jacob. Now there's tension among these brothers as well. That these narratives kind of continue through the cycle of the stories. And then dreams, except dreams function differently. There have been dreams and visions before, but now dreams are going to be a significant part of Joseph's story. And in fact, it is primarily through dreams that Joseph experiences God. Whereas his father and his grandfather, what they had is God actually appeared to them and spoke to them. But Joseph only ever sees God primarily in dreams. So not only are dreams playing a big role, but it's a shift in terms of how Joseph experiences God to how God had been active in the story before Joseph came around. So there's a continuation there, and also a little something that's different. So why is there tension between the brothers? Well, first off, let's be clear, Joseph is a little tattletale, right? Brings a bad report to his father about his brothers. Jacob's favoritism, that's probably not helping matters. And he's kind of a self-absorbed teenage brat. He's not a terribly appealing hero at the beginning of this story. He seems either he's a real brat, or he's he completely is unself-aware. He has no self-awareness whatsoever. "Hey, I had another dream that you all are bowing down to me. Isn't that great? Like, dude, your brothers already hate you. Don't make it worse." This is kind of, Joseph is beginning from kind of a very low point in this narrative. And what about that coat? Let's talk about that many-colored coat, right? This is the version probably many of you think of, right? The Technicolor dream coat. I'm glad you're all muted, so we don't hear anyone start singing right now. So the word here for this coat is ketune panim. Ketune, the first word on the right. Panim is the word on the left, because Hebrew you read from right to left. Ketune panim. And so what in the world does that mean? Well, the problem is that this word pam literally means the palm of a hand or the sole of a foot. Maybe by implication, several would be a long sleeve tunic, That's so. This is one of those. You probably see a footnote in your Bible where it says however it translates this coat. It says meaning of the Hebrew uncertain. This makes no sense. It's a coat with many hands. Would be the most literal rendering of it, I guess. Coat of many hands. Maybe that means it's a long sleeved coat. The coat of many colors comes from the way that this is translated in the Greek. In the Septuagint, they translate this panim as many colors, and the King James version was following the Septuagint and the Vulgate, and so the King James did that translation as well. But the Hebrew has nothing to do with colors. That's not here. So we don't really know what this coat was. What matters is the way it functions symbolically in two ways. First off, this coat is a symbol that Jacob loves Joseph more than the other brothers. That's the thing that drives them. It's a symbol of that love, this fancy coat, whatever it looks like. It's also a foreshadowing of his future role. Because if you buy, for example, that this should be understood as a long-sleeved coat, then that would mean this is a sort of coat that a royal official would wear, not the sort of coat the average person wears. So it's foreshadowing his future royal role that he will play within the Egyptian household. But we don't really actually know what the coat looks like or means. So pause for a second. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah, go ahead. You're going to have to unmute yourself, I think, Rana. Go ahead.
Okay. My understanding of that, when you say with hands, could be because it was so elaborate, it was worked on or made with many hands, making it ornate. Then it fits with the hands.
Yeah, that's a good way of attacking it. I like that. That's helpful. Anyone else? Comments, thoughts, questions? So let's see how this is all going to work out for Joseph. I'm going to just, spoiler alert, it's not going to work out well. Hence the picture. So we'll continue with verse 12 of chapter 37. So Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." Joseph answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it's well with your brothers in the flock, and bring back word to me." So like not only is he a tattletale, but his father encourages this behavior. His father knows that the last time this happened, he gave a bad report, and so the brothers hate Joseph, but he's still using his son to spy on the other sons. Like, this is, once again, this is the idea that Jacob is not a redeemed character. So he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. It's no idea where he's going. The man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And they saw Joseph from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. And the pit was empty. There was no water in it. Let me just pause real quick here because I want you to know what it's talking about for these pits. So let me real quick open up a different screen here to show you. So what this pit is, this is a water cistern. And these were gigantic caverns, sometimes natural, oftentimes not natural, but in actuality hewn out of rock. And the idea was in the desert that they would fill up with water when there was a rainy season, and then you would have water. But that also meant that these cisterns would be very dangerous sometimes to fall into or be thrown into. Let me see, cistern in Israel. Let me see a good picture of one here. Here we go. So let me screen share again into this. desktop 2. All right, here you go. So you can see what some of these cisterns look like. They're very big. So here's a good one right here. Come on. There you go. So you can see how very big these are. So the idea is that this would fill up with water whenever there was rain. You would also, there would often run channels that would run and be directing water into these cisterns, like gigantic rain barrels. And they were so big that you could literally get, like this guy you can see is getting in and out of it with a ladder. So this is what they're throwing him into. It's a water cistern nearby. I've been in the cisterns at the top of Mount Masada in Israel, where King Herod had his fortress and where the Jewish people had their last stand when they committed mass suicide before the Roman army broke in. Because on top of a mountain in the desert, you're not getting water. You're not going to haul it up there. So they would have these large cisterns. So I just thought that'd be helpful for you all to see what those look like here. Let me go back to my PowerPoint presentation now. All right. All right, so let me put this back on. Screen share to the desktop 2. I'm really good at the technology. Give me a second. Sorry, I hit screen share too long and it couldn't see what I was doing. There we go. All right, PowerPoint. There. All right, we're back on. So that's where they throw Joseph at this point. Again, that's why he says there's no water in it, because if there'd been water in it, he could have just drowned. Continuing with verse 25. Then they sat down to eat. Notice the utter lack of concern for their brother. Let's have lunch. Sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin, and on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother and our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. And when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. You may be noticing there, you're like, wait, are they Ishmaelites or are they Midianites? Because it kind of switches back and forth. Most likely that there were two different versions of this story that have been placed together. One of them was telling that this was the Ishmaelites and the other the Midianites. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility that there are Ishmaelites and Midianites in this travel caravan, that it's both that are in the caravan, and the Ishmaelites do this, the Midianites do this. So just don't be weirded out by that. So then Reuben returns. Remember, Reuben was the one whose plan had been, after his brothers left, to rescue his brother out of the pit. So Reuben returned to the pit, saw that Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where can I turn? And they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, this we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garment and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So what we're seeing here is, yeah, Joseph's kind of like a bratty little teenager, but his brothers are not much better in the way they respond to this, and it's overwhelming in the narrative. Verse 4, can't speak peaceably to him. Verse 4, they hate him. Has the dream, interprets the dream. They hate him even more. Verse 5, they hate him even more. Verse 8, they're jealous of him. Verse 11, they plot to kill him. Verse 20, and the word they're used for kill in Hebrew is harag. That's the same word. It's a much more violent use of, it's not just killing, but it implies a violent way of killing someone. That's the same word used to describe Cain's killing of Abel. exact same Hebrew word used there that you get in Genesis earlier. They strip him of his clothes, verse 24. They throw him in the cistern, verse 24, and then they sell him into slavery. So you could say that he's got a challenging relationship with his brothers. And it's hard when you're reading this text. It's very tempting to kind of want to psychoanalyze the text and to like look at this from, you know, systems theory or psychology, and you can do that. That's fine as kind of an imaginative understanding. We also have to be honest, we don't really know why. We can't really know the insides of people's heads when there are stories about them in the Bible like there were thousands of years ago. It does seem, though, that something about the way Jacob has lived and led his family, he did have some kind of redemption to his arc, but he's been unable to, the strife that he allowed to exist between Rachel and Leah is carried down into his children. He did not seek reconciliation and wholeness there. And so the brothers fight just as much as their mothers used to. And also you get this sense, you know, with not only is it Rachel and Leah, but there's Bilhah and Zilpah, the maids of each of them who their children are part of the promise. So like, this is a very, very dysfunctional family. And one in which Jacob is not stepping forward to take a strong role with his children at all. He's enabling a lot of this to happen. And you're seeing the result of that, how that's all going. And one wonders, you know, if he had not done such a strong cutoff of refusing to go home until his mom was dead and his dad was almost dead, if he maybe would have learned more about reconciliation. He kind of reconciled with Esau, but he never reconciled really with the rest of his family. And this is a true, you know, you can think of it two ways. One is theologically. The biblical text says that the sons of the father are visited upon their children, right? And that happens. We see that happen. And that we understand that from a sociological and system standpoint as well. That a lot of sins and issues that exist in one generation, they carry down generation to generation. Ed Friedman, who was the father of so much systems theory, was a Jew first, and he found systems theory by reading the Hebrew Bible. The generational patterns of behaviors he found present in the Old Testament narrative. So that actually is a case where the psychological understanding actually came first from a biblical reading and not the other way around.
Even the reconciliation with Esau is more Esau's initiative than his.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Esau definitely comes away looking like the bigger man, which is ironic given how his descendants are then treated by the Israelites, right? That the Edomites become this hated other nation. It's also a bit of irony here that Jacob is tricked by clothing, right? Because you remember, right, this is what Jacob did to Isaac. He put on his brother's clothes and he was like, hey, is this, you don't sound like Esau. No, here, touch my arm, it's me. So the same sin that he visited upon his father, his sons are now visiting upon him when it comes to pretending that Joseph is dead when in actuality he's not. So there's a carrying through of this narrative, definitely. All right. Note the inclusio. So what we see here is another thing of looking at a chiasm is an inclusio. That's where you have the same thing at the beginning and the end of the story, and that tells you something about that story. And we're going to now read chapter 39. So we're skipping chapter 38 just because it's a lot to get into, but chapter 38 is the story of Judah and Tamar. And I don't have time to get into it. It's really its own story. Some people think this is an interlude in the narrative. Other people think that this story plays a role in what happens later in the text with Judah. I follow that line of thinking. So we won't get into chapter 38 now. But like I said, get this book on Genesis if you want to dig into it later. It's really fascinating. So after the Judah moment, this Judah and Tamar incident happens, we return in chapter 39. Now Joseph, remember, was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him. Yahweh was with him, right? It's not just the generic God, that Yahweh was with him. and that Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house, put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of Yahweh, the Lord, was on all that he had in house and in field. So he left all he had in Joseph's charge, and with him there he had no concern for anything but the food he ate. Things are going well. Now, Joseph was handsome and good looking. Those words there in Hebrew are the same words used to describe his mother Rachel when she was described as graceful and beautiful. So the beauty of Rachel is passed down into Jacob. Handsome and good looking, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house. He has put everything he has in my hand. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except yourself, because you're his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the members of her household and said, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me." And I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Then she kept the garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant who you brought among us came in to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." When his master heard the words his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. For the Lord was with Joseph, and he showed him steadfast love, and he gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison. And whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, for the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. So there's an inclusio going on here at the beginning of the text. We're told that the Lord was with Joseph. Then all of these horrible things happen. Unwanted sexual advances, false accusations. He's jailed. And then we're told the Lord was with him once more, right? That's framing that in the midst of all of this horrible stuff he's going through, that the Lord is with him. And because of that is blessing him, and Joseph is rising higher and higher in authority, head of the household. And even when he gets thrown in jail as a result of the advances, the jailer loves him and puts him in charge of the jail. So the Lord is with him. Also notice the development that's already beginning with Joseph's character. He's already not the same person we met in chapter 37. He's a hard worker. He's not a tattling teen. He's working very hard, doing a good job at his work, not wandering in the field. He also handles the seduction calmly and fairly. He doesn't rat her out to the husband. He doesn't get angry with her or yell at her or do anything that he could have done. He just reiterates, "No, and let me tell you why." And he lays out the reasons very honestly why this is not something that he could ever do. So we're already seeing Joseph is developing into a stronger sort of a person than he was before. The presence of the Lord with him is changing him in some ways, right? Questions, thoughts? So we push through, and I want to talk a little bit about this divine providence question. You've got here, this is Yahweh in ancient Hebrew, and then in modern, and then in more modern Masoretic Hebrew at the bottom. That's the Tetragrammaton, the name of God. So in chapter 37, Yahweh's actually not in chapter 37. There's no mention of the Lord in chapter 37. And all of these horrible things happen to Joseph. God's absent from that story. Chapter 39, Yahweh is with Joseph. He's in the story, he's in the text, and bad things still happen to Joseph. So there's a point being made here, asking, so how do we understand divine providence? What does it mean for God to be with you? Doesn't that mean that nothing bad's going to happen to me? Like, that's what it means, right? If God's with me, everything's going to be okay. But that's not how we understand divine providence at all, that bad things do happen to us, even when God is with us. And we'll see later in Joseph's narrative how that's going to be. But there's a tension there that's being introduced to the text. And the end of Joseph's story will resolve that tension for us. But that tension is and should be entering our minds as we're following the story right now. So then we go into chapter 40. And we see that sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord and the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into custody with the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. You remember Joseph's running this prison, basically. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them, and they continued for some time in custody. But one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Each his own dream, and each dream with its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw they were troubled, and he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me the dreams." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream, there's a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup as his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it's well with you. Please do me the kindness to make mention of me to Pharaoh, and so to get me out of this place. For in fact, I was stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should have put me in this dungeon." When the chief baker saw the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "Well, I also had a dream in which there were 3 cake baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." Sorry, no refunds on dream interpretations. On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for his servants. He lifted up the head of his chief cupbearer and the head of his chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, but he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker was hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So there's an important point being made here that this is a dream interpreter, but this is not some kind of, pagan and divination of dreams. The reason Joseph can interpret the dreams is because he's a child of God. Because interpretations belong, as what he said, God knows what dreams are. I'm a follower of God. That means that God will reveal the interpretation to me. So there's a point being made here. So we have the cupbearer first. The interpretation of his being that Pharaoh will lift up your head. And that's an expression in Hebrew. To lift up someone's head means to look kindly upon them, to raise them up. So he's using a Hebrew idiom. It literally means he will lift up your head, which means you'll be restored to office. But of course, the cupbearer forgets Joseph, doesn't remember him. For the baker, who will be beheaded, that he will lift up your head from your shoulders. So it's like it's a clever wordplay, kind of mean. So maybe he hasn't quite grown into the person we're hoping he'll become. And sure enough, he was. God. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing God at work saving Joseph, but not by some miraculous intervention into Joseph's life, but instead by turning Joseph into a person of resourcefulness, right? A person of resourcefulness. Same thing happens with Pharaoh. We'll go ahead and look at Pharaoh's story. This is verse 41. We're going to skip around a little bit in this one. After 2 whole years, so 2 more years he stays in prison. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile, and there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. But then he fell asleep and dreamed a second dream. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke. So it was a dream. In the morning, his spirit was troubled. So he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them to Pharaoh. Why? Because interpretation of dreams belongs to God, not the magicians of Pharaoh, right? Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Oh, I totally forgot, right? I remembered my faults today. So once you were angry with me, you put me and the chief baker in custody and the captain of the guard. We dreamed, we had the same dream, a meeting, and a young Hebrew was there, a servant of the captain of the guard. When he told him, he interpreted our dreams, giving an interpretation to each. And as he interpreted to us, so it turned out, I was thrown him out in the eye, and you hanged the baker. Remember that? Oh, that was the best. Pharaoh, you old guy. So then Pharaoh sent for Joseph and was hurried out of the dungeon. When Joseph had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh basically recounts the dream a whole second time. So drop down to verse 24 of the second half. When I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me. Pharaoh said to Joseph, Joseph's dreams are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years, and the dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh, God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout the land of Egypt. After them, there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land. The plenty will no longer be known in the land, because the famine will follow, for it will be very grievous. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dreams means that the thing is fixed by God, and that God will shortly bring it about. Now, therefore, he wasn't asked for advice, but he's going to give some, because, he is his father's son. Let Pharaoh select a man who's discerning and wise. Anyone, maybe someone who's like really good at interpreting dreams. Maybe he'd be the sort of like really a wise person. And what you should do is put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land during the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find anyone else like this? One in whom is the Spirit of God. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown this, there's no one as discerning and wise as you. Oh, Joseph has got him hook, line, and sinker. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. Remove his signet from his hand. Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second command, and they cried out in front of him, bend the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up a hand or foot in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, as his wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Now Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh the king, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. So similar sort of thing, right? We've got a couple of dreams, and Joseph is interpreting them in terms of what they mean. There's actually a parallel, which is really interesting here, with a 28th BC Egyptian text that tells the story of King Djoser, who was a pharaoh in the 28th century. And this Egyptian text says, I was in distress on the great throne, and those who were in the palace were in heart's affliction from a very great evil, since the Nile had not come in my time. For a space of 7 years, grain was scant, fruits were dried up, and everything which they eat was short. Now, I don't bring this parallel up to suggest that this King Djoser is the same Pharaoh Joseph is dealing, though it's possible, but that this is a part of the cycle of the climate in Egypt. The Nile goes in and out, and when you go through in Egypt these massive dry seasons where the Nile would literally dry up to almost nothing for 7 years. And the way that you do agriculture in Egypt is you're running water from the Nile into all of your fields to grow stuff. So if there's no Nile, there's no water source for you to water from. So just an interesting parallel for you that I thought you might like there. What's going on here, right? Joseph, let Pharaoh find a wise and discerning man. And Pharaoh picks Joseph, gives him new garments of office, right? An echo of his old coat that his father had given him, now being fulfilled in the garments. It's not the same Hebrew word. It's not that same panim word, but it's a similar kind of fancy coat, right? And then we'll get to Joseph and his brothers. So what I think I want to do is I want to pause here because we're near the end of our time. And that way we can spend next week doing the rest of Joseph's story and also wrapping up some of the rest of the Joseph narrative. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, put us back on gallery view here. So we got about 5 minutes. Thoughts, questions, comments? I see some stuff in the chat. Let me see what I missed in the chat. I just realized the brothers never admitted they'd see Joseph. This we found, right? Totally. They totally are lie. It's super the Hebrew Bible. What did the NIV have that was different for you, Matthew? I hope you're muted still. There you go.
There. No, it was interesting because the concept was exactly the same, but the language was totally different and moved around. So at the end of the day, the whole verse came to the same point, but in a completely different direction.
Yeah.
So it was because I was following along. I didn't have mine here. I had just this one, a student Bible,
Right.
and it's NIV, and the language is completely different. So it was just kind of interesting.
The NIV is what's called a dynamic equivalence translation. So they're less interested in following the word order of the Hebrew and more interested in saying the sense of the words, sometimes effectively and sometimes a little less effectively, I would say. I like the NRSV because to me, it's the best balance between not being like the New American Standard is really, that's the goal. If you want a literal translation of the text, read the New American Standard version. That's the gold standard for a very literal translation. But that also means it's a little wooden sometimes. It's hard to catch some of what it means. Some of the art or the poetry just doesn't translate that way. So that's why I like the NRSV because it's very accurate, but it's a little more readable. But yeah, if you're in the market for a study Bible and you really are looking for that kind of lock solid with the Hebrew, the NASV is the best to go.
Okay, thanks.
Other comments, thoughts? Yeah, Michelle.
Yeah, so 2 things actually. Notice that Joseph and Moses were Egyptian royalty, basically, right? And is Joseph Moses' ancestor?
No, he's not. I'm sorry. Moses is the ancestor of Levi.
Okay.
So he's a Levite. So he's not Joseph's direct ancestor. Joseph would have been his super great uncle.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's one of the other brothers. Yeah, but you're right. And there's this the way that Egypt functions in Hebrew. The word for Egypt is Mitzrayim. The way that Mitzrayim functions in the Old Testament is fascinating. Sometimes a place of safety and security, sometimes a place of terror and oppression and violence. At times you have Hebrew people in positions of leadership in Egypt. At other times you have God telling the Israelites or the Jewish people, don't look to Egypt to save you because that's going to corrupt you. There's this very, very interesting push and pull between how we feel about Egypt given how close they are. I mean, you can think of it in the same way that some European nations that have been around a while have a very much love-hate relationship. Maybe think like France and England, right? There's sometimes they're really great, and other times it's like we hate each other. You see that same dynamic play out in this story here. And we'll see that when Joseph ends and dies, he dies an Egyptian. He's buried in a sarcophagus. He is a full-throated, probably at that point, culturally Egyptian in all ways. We'll see that when we get to the end of his story.
It's kind of interesting that Egypt and Israel had that peace accord later, in the 70s.
Yeah.
I kind of thought about that as I was reading through the Old Testament again, and just interesting how it all came around full circle.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, even like now when there's tensions between Egypt and the modern state of Israel, those tensions run deep, very deep. It's not just like two nations having issues, but two nations that have long struggled with one another. And it's felt religiously, culturally, socially, economically. There's still that huge tension that even exists now in the nation state of each successor nation.
Not related to the Joseph stories, but I think it's interesting that there's that long genealogy of Esau's descendants. Why would they be interested?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. We got the same thing with the Ishmaelites, right? The narrator wants to end the story. The narrator wants to end the story of Esau, and so he ends it by giving you a genealogy. It's kind of like, I can't just like ignore the rest of Esau. So like, here are his kids. They're horrible. Now I'm going to tell you about Joseph because he did.
Who are these people on the list, and who knows or cares about any of them?
Right. Yeah, it's the exact same thing he did with yeah, exact same thing he did when he did the Ishmael story, and it functioned the same way that they did the descendants of Ishmael, and now here are the descendants of Isaac, and then he doesn't do a genealogy. He tells the story of Isaac. So there's a parallel here, and here are the descendants of Edom, and now here's the family of Jacob. Jacob was a little shit. Kind of how that story kind of begins. Any other? Go ahead.
Not so much a little shit.
Yeah, right. Any other final comments or questions or thoughts before we wrap up? All right. Well, this has been fun. We'll go ahead and finish off Joseph's story. When I was writing this PowerPoint present, I was like, this is going to be longer than an hour. So I'm glad to know that it's nice that we can take the time and really enjoy the end of Joseph's story. And it's kind of an interesting place to leave it, right? Joseph is now at the top of Egypt, right? There's a famine coming that's going to impact the entire ancient Near East. And so you should be thinking as a reader, crap, what's going to happen to his family, right? And we'll find out next week, same bat time, same bat channel.